The thing we forgot for many years is how much work it takes to make sure democracy continues to function. And now I think we're learning about the importance of investing in democracy on an individual basis, because it's not enough to leave democracy in the hands of somebody else and in the hands of your political leadership. What we're learning is that everybody has to take an active stake if they want to preserve democracy, and it turns out to be a lot harder to organize than you might think. And the promising thing is that the next generation appears to be far more aware and far less complacent than my generation was. I grew up in a time when everything was easy. Now, that's not how it is. And if the new generations can really engage, then I think we can recreate the world and recreate a world of order and meaning without having to go through something horrific like the Second World War to achieve that aim.
With the rejection of the US Senate to the White House's latest bid to pass legislation authorizing $16 billion in financial support for Ukraine, are we at a turning point in the Russia-Ukrainian war?
The Ukrainians have agency beyond the United States. The Ukrainians are going to continue to fight whatever the United States does. We are at a turning point in terms of relations between the executive and the legislature, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States at the moment. If Congress is not going to support American policy in the world, that is an abdication of global leadership on an unprecedented scale. Doesn't mean the Ukrainians are going to lose in their fight with Russia. It does mean the United States is going to appear far less reliable as an ally than it ever has in the past. And I think that change is important, not just for Ukrainians, but for the world at large. We need to sort out these relationships, political dynamics within the United States for the United States to remain a global power. And it's shocking to me that we're in a situation where the richest country in the world is failing to play that role simply because of disagreements at a domestic political basis.
If this trend worsens, will the EU be able and willing to muster capacities on its own and support Ukraine in the long war?
I think that's going to be challenging for the European Union. And that's because the European Union is not actually terribly effective as a security community. The European Union wasn't created for that role, to be honest. That role has always been played by NATO. Unfortunately, the EU is not a military power in the conventional sense, and it's unlikely ever to become one unless there's a significant change in the domestic politics of the European Union. And we haven't seen that happen yet. On the contrary, as much as we're talking about the conflict between the legislature and the executive in the United States, we could also be talking about the difficulties within the European Council on agreeing to aid packages to Ukraine that Europe should be putting forward in any event.
The polls indicate the possibility of Donald Trump returning to the White House. If so happens, can the already weakened US democracy survive another Trump presidency? How can Europe prepare for it?
You'd characterize American democracy as already weakened. It's been weakening for a long time. If Trump comes back in office, it will weaken further. The question is whether we go to the point beyond which it's possible to restore democracy. I don't think we're close to that point yet. And I'm not sure it would even be Donald Trump that would necessarily tip us over. If we accept that the weakening of American democracy is a progressive thing that has this significant tipping point baked into it, where beyond that point, American democracy will not be recovered, Europeans have to prepare for that. And that means that Europeans cannot base their entire strategy for self-defense around an alliance with the United States. It doesn't mean they should abandon the United States as an ally, but it does mean it would be irresponsible not to prepare for a scenario in which the United States were not a reliable ally. So I think there's going to be a need to change policy to strengthen defense and security not just because of what's going on in the United States, but also because the world is becoming a more dangerous place.
With surging isolationism in very dangerous times, is it safe to say that democracy in the US is at stake?
Yeah, I think democracy in the United States has always been at stake. I think it's fair for us to ask, why? Why is the world becoming a more dangerous place? We had democratic institutions, we had a global economy, we had a whole system of international rules that should have made the world safer and easier to manage. And yet somehow what we're experiencing looks the opposite of that. Our political leaders stopped at a certain point trusting us to engage in democratic politics. And so while we kept playing democracy, they lifted ever-increasing numbers of policies away from the deliberative process. That was part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that our wants and desires changed. Everywhere in the world, people began to aspire to different things. And as those aspirations changed, they began to challenge the institutions that we use for policymaking. And unfortunately, the end result has been to break those institutions without offering anything to replace them. And we live in a world now that's increasingly disordered as a consequence. And the problem with disorder is not disorder for its own sake. It's that without those rules and institutions, it gets a lot harder to resolve disagreement, and a lot more tempting to resolve disagreement through coercion and, if necessary, violence. When you see that violence spread into domestic politics, you discover that civilization is actually a very thin and fragile construct, that the capacity for people to do horrific things to one another is always present. And the world is a more dangerous place because that reality is much more prominent today. And unfortunately, it's going to be very, very difficult to change that situation. We lived in a unique moment, kind of a Camelot period. And now we're back in the age of Mordred, a time where violence and conflict is becoming much more the norm, and I'm not sure how we escape.